What does one self-proclaimed Disney villain do when faced with the daunting prospect of creating an entire set of Victorian underwear? Does one succumb to the frothy, lacy, white contraptions that were popular in the 1880s? Or does one embrace one's inner self and go full-on witchy wardrobe? Not a difficult decision. Contrary to popular belief, feminine presenting people of the late Victorian period did not simply wear their corsets laced tightly against their bare skin. Like all other periods in history, they wore a series of undergarments that contributed to the comfort, cleanliness, and construction of their outer garments. Starting, as we will today, with the chemise and split drawers. And I hope you'll stick with me till the end of the video to see the wacky, witchy, family-friendly way I show you the split drawers. We'll be using Black Snail Patterns number 1115 to construct the chemise and drawers, which I've linked to in the description below. The pattern also includes a petticoat, which we'll be making in another video, as well as a fabric stuffed bustle, which we won't because we're going full on lobster tail later. Let's get started. A couple of quick notes for anybody who is thinking about making this pattern. Firstly, if you read the instructions really well, you will see that they are assuming that you have reduced 1.5 inches at your waist because you're wearing a corset. I'm not going to go into all of the reasons I have issues with this, but it's something I want you to be aware of. Most of these are going to be worn under the corset, and therefore, more than likely, if you cut it out with your actual measurements, it's going to be too small. This is a theory, so we'll see at the end of the video whether my theory was right or not, but on the off chance that I am correct, and I think that I might be, I cut a size up. Secondly, I almost missed 2 of the pieces for the chemise. That is piece number 4, which is the back shoulder reinforcement, and piece number 3, which is the front shoulder reinforcement. They're really tiny little pieces, as you can see here with the scissors for scale. Thankfully, I double checked the cutting diagram for all of the pattern pieces, and as you can see here, this is where you can find those 2 little pieces. Piece number 3 is located below the petticoat waistband, and piece number 4 is located slightly above the chemise front. Finally, and I think this is actually a great thing, to reduce paper and reduce waste, they've taken the top and the bottom of the petticoat pieces and the chemise pieces and smushed them together. You see this weird edge here? So what's going to happen is you're going to cut on that indicated line and then spread each of these pieces out by 15 inches and put them on your fabric. Alternatively, you can put paper in between there if you want, but I think this is a great idea because it's going to save so much time. All right, let's get all this laid out and get started on the cutting. The combined yardage of fabric for the chemise, drawers, and petticoat comes to a whopping 8.3 yards of 51-inch fabric. So I bought 9 yards of 90-inch black quilting cotton because it was on sale and I can always use the extras for something else. For some reason, they wouldn't let me buy 8 yards, but they shipped it in an 8-yard piece and then a 9-yard piece. However, when I got it, it was thick and coarse, which is fine for the petticoat, but definitely not what I wanted for the chemise, and the drawers were sus too. So I went ahead and ordered 2 yards of 60-inch black cotton voile to do the chemise with. Here's the final layout for the main pieces of the chemise. The pattern calls for both pieces to be cut on the fold, but to reserve fabric, I decided to cut the back piece on the selvage, giving myself an extra ½ inch for seam allowance. This is going to allow me to move the pieces very close together, as you can see here, giving me enough room to cut out the body of the split drawers out of the voile too, with a little bit left over even. That's a happy accident, friends. I'm still gonna cut the waistband and the reinforcement bits out of the heavier black cotton because it'll hold up better. But the waistband is only a few inches wide and the reinforcement strips are like this big, so I definitely would have been able to cut the entire thing out of the voile. I'm going to put the size I cut out on the screen on the count of 3 in case you need to look away. 3, 2, 1. If you cut this size or smaller, you can definitely make the chemise and drawers out of 2 yards of 60-inch fabric. and probably a few sizes up as well. Larger sizes might need a little bit more, but I don't think more than a ½ a yard tops. I just want to reiterate this point briefly. The pattern calls for 2.2 yards of 51-inch fabric for the chemise and 1.4 yards for the drawers. Just by making one simple change, by adding a center back seam to the chemise instead of cutting it on the fold, I was able to cut out the chemise and the drawers out of 1.5 yards of fabric. Something to think about. The pattern also calls for a bunch of lace. Lace can get expensive, especially if you want to use natural fibers. It also suggests embroidering the tape that you use to cover the seams of the lace. So I decided to go full on with that instead and cut back on the lace detail. I picked out some green ombre embroidery floss out of my stash. This stuff is really cheap and not fun to work with. So I thought this would be a great way to use it up with a very basic, simple design that wouldn't get tangled of little chevrons and stars. Although, looking at it now, it's actually asterisks, greater than and lesser than symbols. Maybe this witch is a math witch? And that's all the tape done. The pattern calls for you to cut out your lace with the guide and gather it down to the edge of the drawers. I'm using pre-gathered lace, which you might recognize if you saw my 1770s David Bowie cosplay. This is polyester and scratchy, but I have like 20 yards of it still, so that's what I'm using. Pin along the markings with wrong sides together. Sew on the machine, then flip the lace down, turning the seam to the front of the drawers. Iron it out. This seems strange, but it's because you then use the embroidered tape to cover the seam. Nothing ever goes as planned. I attempted to sew the embroidered tape onto the bottom of the drawers. Because I didn't do a very good job sewing the lace on the bottom of the drawers, the lines weren't sharp and it just wasn't looking great. So I've decided I'm just going to hand stitch the embroidered tapes down to the drawers. I think I will have a lot more control doing it by hand.
The next day.
Y'all, I will never learn. Yesterday, I was rushing around trying to do more than I had the capacity to do, and I sewed the lace of the drawers on the same side for both pieces. I literally just did this with the project I finished last week. And of course it had to be on like the only annoying fiddly bit of the entire project, right? Of course it had to be on the lace, the hard thing. Everything else is so simple. Oh my God. I can just hear Ren from Ren and Stimpy screaming in my ear.
You stupid idiot!
So, I guess before I do anything else, I'm gonna go unpick one side of the drawers. I removed the tape and promptly ripped a giant hole in the lace. Good job, Jax. Okay, let's try this again. This is the better method I found for sewing the lace. Mark the stitch line in chalk. Then, instead of lining the lace edge up with the edge of the drawers, place it unpinned, slightly overlapping the stitch line and stitch there. That way, less lace is eaten in the seam allowance, and you have much more control on the curved edges. Trim down the seam allowances on the front. Trust me, you don't want to skip this. And then pin down your tape over the seam. If you're making this pattern, I do think that my plan B worked better. So basically what I did was I hand basted the strip of embroidery first using a contrasting color, and then I went ahead and sewed both sides on the machine. Now I do suggest, if you're going to do this, sewing the side of the tape on the edge first before you do the one that's closer to the top of the drawers, just to keep everything nice and neat. I think it looks a lot better. As you can see here, the hand stitched one is kind of clunky. Next, it was time to pin shut the legs. I was a little confused about what to actually pin together. Hot take. It's the two short sides on each piece that get sewn together in a tube to make the legs. Now it's time to finish off the open edge of the drawers. You can opt to close the drawers and have them be completely closed all the way around. The instructions do accommodate for that, but since at this point in the 1880s we're still seeing open drawers, I'm gonna do the open drawers. So instead of hemming it, the instructions say to use bias tape. I'm not using bias tape per se, but I am using a strip of black fabric that I had left over from my embroidery process. It's about 1 inch wide, so I'm making 1/4 inch bias tape. So I'm gonna do this the ballsy way by sandwiching the tape over the edge of the drawers and just sewing it all in one seam on the machine. And by ballsy, I mean not very smart way. The smart way, and the way that I recommend for pretty much everybody, especially if you're new to sewing, is to sew this as you would normal bias tape, where you lay it flat on the right side, sew one edge, and then flip it over and sew the back edge. I just don't have the patience to do it today. Hopefully it'll work. Let's get going. With the binding successfully finished, the next thing to be done is assemble the drawers together. On the front of the drawers, lap one side over the other at about 3/8 of an inch and pin. Then sew them together, working down one side of the drawers, crossing over, and then sewing back up the other side like a long 4-inch U. We're just about done with the drawers, y'all. All we have to do is add the waistband. Originally, I cut this extra long because I wanted to accommodate for the 1.5 inch waist reduction, but I wanted to test my theory, so I went ahead and cut off the excess to see exactly how far off it was from my waist. We'll find out later in the video if that was smart or not. Mark the seam allowance on both sides. Then press up the edges and fold the waistband in half and press one more time. Run a set of gathering stitches along the top of the drawers. Then mark the center of your waistband, open it up and pin the center front. Then gather the drawers down on both sides, pin and baste on the machine. Fold the waistband over and pin, then sew close to the edge. This creates a channel that the drawstring is going to go through. Use a blunt needle to thread your drawstring through the channel. I'm using 1/2 inch cotton tape for this. Don't forget to secure your end so it doesn't come out the other side. All right. That's the drawers done. Let's move on to the chemise. Well, my friends, I put on the drawers to test out the fit and came to realize quite quickly that they are too tight on my thighs. I should have anticipated it because it's not the first time I've had that issue on sewing patterns and regular clothing. Now standing up, it's fine. I don't really notice it. It's loose enough. It's when I sit down that it was so tight, it was uncomfortable. If you are someone who leans towards thicker thighs, I would go ahead and give yourself a few extra inches at the bottom at least. I find that the tops of the drawers are totally fine. It's just like the 6 inches above my knee that are causing me issues. So this is how I fixed it. I cut 2 gores that are 2.5 inches wide and 3 inches tall, with the thought that with the seam allowances that would give me about a 2-inch extra space in the bottom of the drawers. I went ahead and added some tape and lace to make this cute little black lacy pizza, and then I ripped up the seam about 3 inches on the seam line to put in the gores. Now luckily I hadn't got around to felling the inside seam down yet, so this made my life so much easier. I just went ahead and pinned each side, hand sewed them in, and felled over the raw edges. Now when I was cutting the little pizzas, I decided they looked a little small, so I ended up adding an extra inch, so they were 3 inches total extra space minus the seam allowances. It's a lot better than it was, but it still could be a little less tight. One final thought on the drawers before we get started with the chemise, and that is my instinct at the beginning about the pattern having taken out extra waist space to accommodate for a corset was correct. I should have left the extra inches on the waistband instead of cutting it off. Now it's fine because there's a drawstring, so I'm not having too many issues, but there is like a 4-inch gap between the end of the waistband and my center back, and you know, would be preferable if that wasn't the case, because not only is it gaping there, but it's gaping in a split part too, which is unseemly. Let's not talk about that right now. Let's move on. First thing is the reinforcement strips. Mark the seam allowance on all your pieces, then fold up at the mark and press, then stitch that side. Place the pieces on the shoulder and pin, then baste all the raw edges.
I have cast a spell of idiocy on this poor, unsuspecting Jackie. She has never done pin tucks before and is now too lazy to look it up and has completely forgotten to look at the directions. Let's see if she succeeds in her task now. She does not. I win.
I'm not sure if this is actually the right way to do pin tucks, so if you know differently, please let me know in the comments. But at least at this point, I thought to read the directions. Take the dotted line and fold to the solid, making your folds out toward the armpits. Iron and then pin. I found that starting on the outside and working your way in was better than starting on the inside and working your way out. With that hurdle crossed, it was time to assemble the chemise together. As you can see, this voile is very sheer. With lightweight fabrics like this, it's really good to do a French seam, but I hate French seams. So instead, I'm going to stagger my side seams and prep for hand felling. With the sides seamed together, the next step is to apply the lace to the arms and the neckline. The pattern has you do this the same way as you sew on the lace for the drawers, where you sew it with wrong sides together and then flip it up and use more lace or tape or whatever you have to cover the seam. The lace that I've chosen to put on the chemise is just tiny 1/2 inch lace. I don't have 2 different sizes like they suggest in the pattern because this is what I could afford for this project. And so I decided last night that instead of doing it that way, I was going to finish all of the edges of the chemise first and then hand tack the lace down so that I can utilize the entire width of it and so it looks a little bit nicer and I'm not covering it all up. So I just ironed everything in using a small seam allowance, and hopefully I'm going to try and do it on the machine. I love when my plans go the way I want them to. That was perfect. Let's move on. Now it's time to hem the thing. Grab your ruler, your chalk, and your scissors, and let's get started. The back is a little longer than the front. Not sure if that's intentional, and I faffed about a bit with attempting to try and make it look intentional, but then I lost patience and cut it straight across because it's underwear, and nobody's gonna be looking at my hem. Or at least I hope not. Turn up the edge by 1/2 inch. Whoa, autofocus, what you doing? I know this is black on black on black on black, but come on. Once that's done, turn up another 1/2 inch and zip that baby through the machine. Or, you know, hand sew it if that's your bag. Because I'm doing things a little differently from the pattern, next I pin my embroidered tape all along the top edges of the chemise. Then I hand basted the tape down for extra control. I will then hand stitch this down to the chemise like I did with the drawers. Now we're going to add the last of the lace. This is cotton lace that I got from Renaissance Fabrics. Pin it along the very edge of the chemise and then use a running stitch or running back stitch to secure it. Mark the buttonhole on the back strap of the chemise and then the button will go on the front. See how uneven my straps are?
Woof!
I made another boo-boo. This project, if anything, is teaching me that I'm a little burnt out on sewing and have been rushing through this unnecessarily and probably need to take a break. So last night I sat down to do the buttonholes, which was the last thing I had to do, and had a really hard time getting the embroidery floss that I had picked to sew to look nice. It was tearing the heck out of my fabric. This afternoon, I realized that's because there's a reinforcement strip at the top of the shoulders, Jackie. That's where you're supposed to put the buttonholes, not on the super flimsy, super thin voile. Ah! I really don't want to have to take anything out at this point. Here's where the reinforcement strip ends. For some reason, this only happened on the back ones. The front ones are fine. So what I decided to do was to use the existing hole by adding some additional reinforcement fabric to the back. Cut the reinforcement piece slightly larger than the strap. Fold all the rod edges in and pin. Then hit it with the iron. From there, hand sew it to the seam allowance so it's invisible from the outside. Cut into the reinforcement bit where the existing hole is. Now you can go in with your embroidery floss and sew the buttonhole. I'm using 2 strands doubled and waxed and picked a contrasting color because why not? Then all that was left to do was sew on the buttons and we were finished. Finally! A few final thoughts on this pattern before we get to the reveal for the people who are interested in making it. While my instinct to cut the drawers larger was sound, I really do wish that I had cut my normal size for the chemise. Even with pulling the shoulder straps closed, the armholes and the neckline were both a little too big. So if you're doing this series of undergarments, you should be fine to cut out your normal size for the chemise, but I would cut your waistband at least a little bit larger. For the drawers, that is. Despite all my hang-ups, this project was pretty easy and quick to do. Thank you so much for sticking around, y'all. I really appreciate you. If you're enjoying this video and want to support me further, I do have a Ko-fi account which is linked in the description below, where you can stop by and leave me a one-time tip. All the contributions go towards purchasing supplies to keep creating interesting content for you, and you'll be entered into a drawing to receive a handmade historical accessory made by yours truly. All right, let's get our witch on.
Woo! What is this? 'Tis strange. Sisters?
Bye-bye. Don't forget to leave your little children at the door as you go. If you're thirsty for more witchy content, you can check out this video here where I make an 1830s historically inspired bat dress, complete with graveyard scene.